welcome everybody. It's terrific to see that we've got a nice roll-up and interest in today's proceedings. I was really happy when I was asked to, I suppose, be school contact for the CAPITheticAL competition, because for me it brings together a whole group of my interests. So I've always been interested in architecture. I was actually a failed applicant for architecture degree and never quite made the grade, but so I sort of downgraded, unfortunately, and ended up having to go to art school. But but gladly so, and realised that actually I'd ended up in the right place, particularly because I ended up here at the Canberra School of Art. But not only that, this competition gives an opportunity for this school to start to consider another element which is important to me, which is collaborative work. And it gives an opportunity, I think, for people in particular disparate workshops around the school who normally don't have opportunities on a regular basis to perhaps put their heads together and think about what they might produce as a team or through collaborative work in approach to perhaps defining a problem or coming up with solutions to a problem or an issue or an opportunity. So today, and what I want to do first of all is talk about the aims of today and some of the objectives, and then introduce our speakers who we're fortunate to have with us today from the CAPITheticAL and from CAPITheticAL, from the Australian Institute of Architects and so on, and they're going to outline in detail some of the details of the competition, historical elements and so forth. But first of all, what we want to do today is determine exactly what CAPITheticAL is, why are they actually staging the CAPITheticAL competition, and who is likely to participate, and who is the audience for this competition, when the submissions are actually put in, what is the value of these submissions, and who are the audience and who's going to benefit from it. How do we submit to this competition, and where would the outcomes that are submitted, where will they be presented? And what is the value of the competition, and what does it offer the community at large? So they're just some of the aims that we want to kind of unpack today through the session. I'll just run through who our lineup is today. We've got Robyn who's come in as Creative Director of the Centenary of Canberra, and she has, I believe, conceived much of the idea of what CAPITheticAL is and the competition, and she's going to outline what CAPITheticAL is. Then we've got David Headon, who is the History Advisor for the Centenary of Canberra, and he's going to look back at the historical context for the initial competition that was run for the design of Canberra, inviting people who put in those initial submissions over 100 years ago that resulted in this Walter Burley Griffin designed city, Walter and Marion Burley Griffin designed city. And then, of course, we've got David Parken, who is CEO of the National Institute of Architects, and he's going to talk about the competition from the perspective of the Institute of Architects and talk about the role and place of architects and artists in authoring our built environment. So, first of all, may I introduce Robyn, who's going to talk about CAPITheticAL.
Thanks very much, Rowan. We've only got 10 minutes. I'll have to go really fast. At this stage of planning for the Centenary of Canberra, telling you about the program takes about two days. At the moment, we try to run one-day sessions and they don't work. We have to have 2 days to do it. It's immense. It's a vast, vast program. Many people are only just waking up to the fact that the centenary is happening and ideas are pouring in. We're trying desperately to do a calendar at the moment, and every time we do it, we revise it. It comes back 3 days later and we've got 58 more things to put in it. So it's a never-ending development of things that we're going to do during 2013. Briefly, however, what we celebrate in 2013 is largely the moment on March the 12th, 1913, when Lady Denman, the consort of the Governor-General of the time, stood in a paddock with much pomp and ceremony and said, "This place shall be named Canberra." This is taken as Canberra's birthday. That's what we celebrate. But of course, what we're doing at the moment is going through sequential centenaries. It's happening monthly, almost, the number of things, and Dave Headon will explain some of that. But it was this year. at the end of April that the international competition was announced for a new capital city for Australia, and I don't think that we can underestimate what that meant for Australia, and CAPITheticAL is part of that. Even before Federation, people was talking about the need for a capital. And it wasn't ever just a stoush between Sydney and Melbourne. It was a deep, complex, interesting, robust, fascinating public conversation, the like of which probably is impossible today given the parlous state of public conversation and the way that's reported in the media. It was honourable, idealistic, hopeful, passionate, and it cared about what Australia as a country valued and what kind of a capital the country needed. Next year, May 23rd, was when the winners, the Burleigh Griffins, were announced. And so we're paralleling some of these. Dave Headon's done a great job already in denoting the survey, for instance, which was conducted in I think 10/11, Dave, if that's right. The ceding of the land from New South Wales happened on January the 1st, 1911. So we're constantly going through. Duntroon, the first defence here, happened 100 years ago this year. So we're in a period of centenaries, but it's that March the 12th, 1913 that we sort of celebrate as the official birthday. I suppose that I could have taken the available monies initially put up by the ACT, now joined by the federal government, corporate philanthropists, corporate sponsors, etc., and said, yes, let's have the biggest boastful festival we possibly can, because it would amount to the largest budget one had ever seen for a 2-week or 3-week festival, say in March. I didn't want to do that because largely the centenary is about revealing to both Canberrans, to the nation and to the world what Canberra really is, not what the mythology of Canberra is. We start to deal in this. People think outside Canberra, those who haven't visited, often think that Canberra is this, a flat platform where nothing else happens but the hosting of federal government and the hosting of national cultural institutions. What we aim to do through 2013 is go, you're wrong, it's this. We're popping it up. We're saying this is a live, active, innovative, incubating, lively 21st century city that has a whole lot of great credentials about it. It is a great 21st century city and it deserves to be the national capital still. It was brilliantly designed. It was designed, as I'm sure Dave will talk about, with idealism, altruism, poetry in mind, as well as simply the planning of a city. And that plan still exists in many ways. If the competition in 1911 was, here's the map, here's the landscape, we want you to sit the city inside this landscape, it's quite clear that that's what we still have. One part of the pop-up is to expose people to Canberra's natural calendar so that we can show how the seasons work here. If anybody has any particular Indigenous knowledge about the seasons, then we've tried our hardest and we haven't been able to find out. So at the moment we're locked into 4 seasons. I've just come from the Northern Territory. I know there are 6 seasons. They're really well documented. If anyone knows the language, the words and the history of the 6 or 8 or however many seasons, we'll overlay them as well. We're going to program seasonally. At the moment, to give you an idea of how big this whole thing is, the pagination that I've attempted for the big catalogue, which we'll launch in September of next year, is currently running to 180 pages, just skimming the program. As I said, it takes 2 days to talk about, and we've just started to do this calendar, and at the moment it's running to a double column, small type print a week. So it's absolutely massive. We'll do a preview and that will sort of set out the shape of the year next March, on the 12th of March, the birthday, the 99th birthday. We'll preview it and then we'll save up a few juicy bits to deal out in September, but we're constantly revealing things along the way. So it's a massive celebration. Now, anytime you get to one of these celebrations that denotes an anniversary, there's always a lot of discussion about reenactments and how you do history, and, you know, the fact that we've got a historian on board who was certainly on board long before I was on the team. Is it only going to be about the history? Well, yes, you have to denote the history. You have to explain to people what the history was actually about and demythologise in some senses, elevate into the altruistic, etc. But for me, it's very important that we also reimagine the capital. We need to look at what the capital does. I mean, the fact that they had an international competition 100 years ago was a bold, innovative idea. There wasn't a big global conversation. It had really just started. I think 1910 was the first planning conference. Is that right, Dave? In London, the first big planning, and a year later, they decide to have an international competition for a capital for a very young nation. So from the very start, Canberra was an innovative idea long before it was actually a city. And I believe it's remained so. When I look at the kind of things that the CSIRO tell me, if we believe in our democracy, that's taken a little bit of work at the moment, but if we do believe in our democracy, it was nurtured here. The CSIRO tells me that every time you get on a plane or use a mobile phone, you are using Canberra-invented technology. Every bit of wheat you eat was invented here. 70% of the world's wheat was invented here. It has always been a great innovator, and we want to celebrate that. So the celebration is about science. It's about sports. The stuff that we are the biggest participatory city, sports participatory city anywhere in Australia. We've got more bicycles, we've got more green buildings. It's an amazing place at the moment, and we want to tell people about that. Don't just rely on picking up your paper. Canberra just stole 10% of your taxes. Canberra made war on farmers. Canberra did this. Canberra did that. The national symbolism is incredibly important. In fact, the 4 spheres of Canberra is important. Local, regional, national, international. Nobody else has 100 embassies sitting right here. And part of the shyness of Canberra is, just imagine if you had all the embassies lined up on Northbourne Avenue. Imagine, it'd be like you'd be in Disneyland as you came in. You know, there's some mad architecture both sides of Northbourne Avenue, but you don't see it. It's hidden in the landscape. It's hidden in the bush capital. We're going to celebrate the shops in 2013. There is no other city that has signs that say, shops this way. Why? Because you can't see them. And people don't see Canberra. It's a city that requires a bit of digging. It's not in your face. It's not like the big cities around the world that we all love and we love to be in. This one really needs a bit of digging to get the best out of it. So, the CAPIThetical. We knew that the celebration had to be a lot about the Burley Griffins, a lot about the planned city, a lot about the fact that you can still see that plan amazingly 100 years ago. There are so few cities in the world that you could say we can see what the original designer had in mind when they planned this city. How do we translate that into something that would be appealing to a younger group of people, to professionals in design, architecture, planning at the moment? How do we make it real? Okay, let's put all those people with fresh ideas, with fresh attitudes about what the changing environment means in Australia, the changing multicultural complexity of our nations, the fact that Indigenous people are now acknowledged here, our place in the region, etc. Let's put all those people thinking about those things in planning and architecture already, artists who fantasise about all those things and also make their stories in art about all those changing conditions in Australia. Let's put them in the same position that those people were in 100 years ago. Let's say, hypothetically, and, here's one of the provocations. Let's say that there is, fairly soon, within the next few years, another referendum about the Republic. If the Australian people decided, differently from the last referendum, that there should be a republic, would people saying, well, should there be a different kind of national representation of a new republic? If this is the Asian century, if India and China are going to be the global leaders in economy, culture, and not the United States or Europe, both of whom are struggling with their economies at the moment, would you start thinking about a capital with closer ties to the north of the region? Broome and Darwin have a lot of rain. They don't have a water problem up there, and they're very close to the sources of power. So put yourself into that position. And so what we're asking, we are demanding, in fact, of all participants in the CAPIThetical to go and look at the history, to read the stuff that Dave's written that's on our website, to read the stuff that you can get through the Australian Architects Association website. Have a look at the 46 all up, wasn't it? 46 finalists? 46 finalists. 45 of them were hypothetical designs. Only one of them got built. There were already 45 hypotheticals. Go and have a look what was imagined by Agash and Saarinen and the people that lost out. Acquaint yourself with the history, understand the importance of the public debate and translate that into the present and see how you go. That's really what the CAPIThetical is about. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that a lot of people will think this capital is perfectly placed where it is. We're actually running a competition, a project. We're trying to develop a project at the moment, which is about the Murray River and the fact that through the ACT we can link 5 states. If you move the capital anywhere else, it will be more remote from places than it is at the moment. So it may be ideal, a beautiful climate, 4 seasons. It might be beautifully placed. I think many competition entries will look at this place and say, yep, it's right where it is, but this is how I'm going to tweak it. Out of that, there may come real practical advice about Canberra's future in this situation. Other people will say, communications are so perfect now, we're nearly into 3D Skype. Why would you need to build anything? Why wouldn't you have a virtual capital? Why can't people just talk from their own constituencies on Skype, etc.? I think there'll be a lot of great questions around this, and the idea is in the spirit of an innovative, incubating Great Canberra from its inception. From this moment, we are still that, and we are confident enough to have this really fresh game of thinking. I think it'll come up in the questions afterwards, but clearly we're hoping that professional design teams from everywhere, we have, I think it's well over 800 registrations of interest. We have multiple thousands of visits to the site since we launched only a few months ago. The registrations are coming from all over the world. There are at the moment some interesting places that are developing new capitals. They might have a really good look at this. We are hoping that they will be design teams, professionals. It is over $100,000 in prizes. There is a student prize, but that doesn't mean that the winner of the student prize might also not take out the big prize. So one ought to take this reasonably seriously. There's a lot in it. While we hope that there will be a lot of serious architectural entries in this, a very high quality of entrant, it doesn't stop artists, and that's you group, it doesn't stop artists having a crack. Send in a fabulous drawing. Send in an idea, team up with another group, find an architect and team up, find a town planner, make your own team and start to decide that you'd like to be part of that planning. That's really what it's all about. It is a hypothetical, it's a game, it's fun, it allows you to use your talent in any way you particularly wish, and I really hope that you all participate.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. It's always difficult to follow Robyn Archer, God. Talk about a recipe for disaster, but nevertheless, I'll do what I can. She, as always, has eloquently summed up the vision, the inspiration, the challenge, the passion that's available to anyone entering the CAPIThetical competition. I think she mentioned about the response already, and we do understand that we've got over 800 registrations of interest nationally and internationally, which is terrific straight off. I only learned a couple of days ago, they put it on their site on August the 5th. They've had almost 40 registrations of interest on their website. So there's plenty of activity. But my job today, not only to, the difficult act of following Robyn Archer, but it's to probably value add in the context of what she said about CAPIThetical in reference to the past, because if ever there was a case of the past absolutely enriching and potentially challenging the present and the future, it is the competition that took place 100 years ago. And I want to say just a few things about it, because I suspect it would be, as Rowan just said, better to pick up in question time and to point you to a few things rather than to sort of elaborate. To give just one example of what's occurred in the very recent past, only in the last couple of weeks, that I wasn't aware of, I'm certain that some of the people in the audience were aware. When you look at that competition 100 years ago, you had the first place to the Griffin design, number 29 out of 137. As Robyn correctly said, there were 46 shortlisted, but 137 entries that were publicly nominated. Every part of the Canberra story is a story, and that's one of them. It's now become certain in my eyes from the research done that there were at least 200 entries and possibly as many as 400. That is to say, the ones that didn't meet criteria, perhaps I can pick that up in question time, will move to the side. Ultimately, they said there were 137, and they were a fascinating 137, approximately 120 of them from the design professions, and the other 15, 17 were selections of individuals, e.g. an astronomer, e.g. a mapper, e.g. a shearer, e.g. a miner, e.g. a teacher, and it went through. Now, they weren't particularly great entries, but nevertheless they were a selection. That in itself is a story, like so much of Canberra's past 100 years ago, and this competition in particular. Robyn made reference to the present and talking about certain biases that still exist in pockets around the country. That notion of Canberra as the cemetery with lights, 7 suburbs, 25 suburbs, 70 suburbs in search of a city. The best view is the back of, a departing train, etc., etc. Not only could nothing be further from the truth in 2011, absolutely the case when you go back 100 years. There was such a wonderful build in Canberra in terms of ideas. Just a couple of things about it and no more than that. Enough to say that the way I read Australian history, such as it is, that the first 50 years of the 20th century, almost inevitably via World War, Depression, World War, were relatively conservative times. Well, it's worth those of you who are wanting, and I hope that's virtually everyone in the room, to enter CAPITheticAL, it's worth having a look at the second 50 years of the 19th century, because that was the formative period for thinking and indeed federation and the ideas that then burst upon the Australian nation post-1901. And one of the results of that, of course, was this design competition in 1911-12. Have a look at that, and if I can, and I'm quite happy, Barb, and for the School of Art, we produced about a year and a half ago 5 booklets on the deeper Canberra history. I'll leave one set here, there's probably another set already here, but it was 3 authors, Greg Wood, the former High Commissioner to Canada, Australian High Commissioner, myself and Ian Warden from the Canberra Times. Greg did 2, I did 2 and Ian did 1. And I will only make reference to my 2 because in the case of this one, and Robyn was talking about the 12th of March 1913, and on the podium, that is the photo on the front. I talk about the argument of the centenary generally, but it gets down to some of the inspiration that existed then, compared, for example, to the paucity, again Robyn alluded to that, in the public discourse today in 2011. And to give you some idea, and it's only one, it's the only one that I will quote, but these were the instructions of the Minister for Home Affairs, Hugh Mahon, went on to distinguish himself as the only parliamentarian ever in the Australian Parliament to be dismissed from the Australian Parliament. I don't mean for an hour or 2 hours or a day, I mean full stop. For seditious utterances in 1920, Hughes put him out, but he was Minister for Home Affairs in 1908. And I don't know who wrote these instructions, but these were the instructions of that minister to the surveyor. And I'm only reading one section, but to give you some idea of the times. These were the instructions. The surveyor will bear in mind that the federal capital should be a beautiful city, occupying a commanding position with extensive views and embracing distinctive features which will lend themselves to the evolution of a design worthy of the object, not only for the present, but for all time. Consequently, the potentialities of the site will demand most careful consideration from a scenic standpoint, with a view to securing picturesqueness, and also with the object of beautification and expansion. Now, if ever there was a typical utterance of the idealism of the times, that is it. You got it in the politicians, many of whom had been born overseas, e.g. Andrew Fisher, the Prime Minister through this period, knew the coal mines in Scotland, Christ knows what that was like, before the turn of the century, when he was 8, 9, 10, 11, turns up here, becomes Prime Minister, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and is Prime Minister from 1910 to 1913. This is the man who wanted a break from the politicians and the politics in Melbourne, so he'd go down to a house where he could talk to the artists. He brought on the Historic Memorials Committee. He brought on the art competition to paint Canberra in 1913. He was very interested in symbols. He was interested in postage stamps. He changed the coat of arms to the coat of arms that we have today. Fisher was very interested in the symbols that make up a nation, and that was a part of the idealism as well. Just one more point, because it is pertinent, and I pick it up in this booklet in brief. I'm sure some of you in the audience would have a knowledge of those extraordinary international expositions, trade and cultural expositions, the first of which, you would certainly know it, was the Crystal Palace, Paxton's Crystal Palace in 1851. According to the way I read international expositions, there were 18 between 1851 and 1900. What Australians don't know, virtually all, and certainly this Australian didn't know till a few years ago, that numbers 9, 10, 11 and 12 were in Australia. The first, Sydney, 1879, the Garden Palace, which burnt to the ground 3 years later in 1882. In case you're interested, if you know Sydney, if you're on the steps of Mitchell Library looking straight over the Botanic Gardens to the harbour, that's where the Garden Palace was. A better building, in my humble opinion, than the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, which was purpose-built in 1880. It's one of only 2 World Heritage listed buildings that we have today. In Australia, that was built in 1880. It would come again for Melbourne in 1888, and in the middle you had Adelaide in 1887. What that meant was Australians were bringing the world to Australia. It was no accident that we had an international competition. It was no accident that it was a superb brief. Now, on that very point, check out the booklets, and you can get them online on the Canberra 100 website. Check those out. But I better put in another plug for a thing that Robyn was keen to see for CAPIThetical. 2 component parts attached to the CAPIThetical link. They look like online that. That is to say, they are branded in much the same way, to use that god-awful term, but nevertheless, much like the booklets. Now, in the case of those 2 links, in the first one, I just, as objectively as I could put it, went with about 4,500 words on the original competition. But perhaps more challenging was about 1,500 words on the brief itself. Look at that brief 100 years ago, look at the conditions of CAPIThetical, and you will see, amongst other things, that it reads, and that's the only other thing I'll read, entries should demonstrate knowledge of the debates, influences and processes that led to the competition in 1911-12. And Robyn talked about that. You will not find anything more invigorating, and if you engage with those international expositions, it will be the more so. And if you have a look at the Australian ones, and I suggest that's a great idea, also look at one other. And that was the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. We talk about big populations and big groups going along. You think, oh, they must have been way smaller in the 19th century. Try number of people through the turnstiles, 80 million. 80 million went through the turnstiles over 6 months. And on one day, 1 million. On Chicago Day, 1 million people went through. They were fascinated. And all of that lies back of our competition. Because when they read the potential participants in that competition, the brief, they too were challenged, just like you for CAPIThetical, to get themselves knowledgeable about the recent design past. Robyn made reference to London in 1910 in October. That was 5 months before our competition was announced. And there you had all the best planners getting together for the very first time. The amount of pages in the proceedings of that, 860. You can get that online as well. There is so much available. So the idea with CAPIThetical, and I hope there are many entrants coming from this room, is to engage with it. And you can certainly engage artistically. That's going to be, I think a potential triumph for the competition is to have a number of the design professions, if you like, the arts, participating in this particular one. I'm sure there are questions. I'll pretty much stop except for one. I said one detail. I learned it only the other day at organising a lecture series, and the lecturer was Robert Bell, who I'm sure has talked here, a curator, senior curator at the National Gallery, and he talked about Eliel Saarinen, that is to say the Finn who came second in the competition 100 years ago. What this Australian didn't know, shamefully he said, or shamefacedly, and that was that I was well aware that Eliel had a son once he went to America called Eero, and that Eero went on to, of course, to a distinguished design career. Eero was a judge for the Opera House competition. Not only that, but he was a judge who didn't turn up for the final judging until late. And according to the Finnish ambassador, and according to Robert Bell, it would appear true, he turned up late, and one design that had already not made the shortlist and was in just the sort of B team was won by Johan Utzon. And according to the story, it appears factual, Eero had a look, made sure that he was across all of them, picked the one, the Hudson design, there out of that pile, and stuck it in the shortlist, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's fascinating to look at 100 years ago, but if ever there was a design competition with so many connections and sort of areas of inspiration for the president for CAPIThetical, that is it. Cheers. And then the French embassy.
David Parken, who's the CEO of the National Institute of Architects, and he's going to speak to us about, as a partner of this competition, from their perspective, how we might approach it. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here. I'd like you to consider me the mechanic, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the mechanics of what's going on. We're very happy to partner with the ACT government. We've been engaged to administer the competition, so we're doing so. Robyn and David's talked about the interest so far. We're very, very pleased with that. I think Robyn's extremely pleased with that, so we want to see those convert into entries. So what are we asking? And we're asking a few questions here, and I just wanted to read out a couple just to zoom in on those. Would you build a new capital today, or could the Australian Federation be expressed in a different way? And that's quite a probing question, and I think the digital world that we're in would really could really be explored in that. Would it be a city in a conventional sense or not? If not, what form might it take, e.g. virtual? What ideas would drive its design and development? And I think ideas, it is an ideas competition. I mean, the good thing about this competition is it doesn't have to get built, right? That's a really good thing because most of my guys end up in competitions that have to get built, and that's a different problem to solve. How would 21st century social, political and environmental factors influence the nature of the city? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, or the way I see cities being discussed today. Of what should our national capital consist? I mean, is it just, buildings? I mean, really a city is about people, and if you read about the development of cities, it's people that make cities vibrant and great places to be. Buildings are just places to do things. It's the people that really make a city. So where are we at as a society today? Well, interestingly, you may or may not know, but Australia now has an urban policy. I mean, this is fantastic. The Commonwealth Government for years has been saying that cities are the responsibility of the states and territories, but no, we now have an urban policy, which is terrific. And under that policy, we're debating an urban protocol, and the idea of an urban protocol is to explore what we want to see in our cities. And I think the way I describe that to you is it's about the public realm. Urban design and urban spaces are the spaces that citizens occupy in their everyday going about their business. It's not their private domain, which is their residential private space, but it's the place that they mostly occupy during their waking hours, the comings and goings. And this, what I wanted to talk about there was the opportunity for collaboration and involvement of art, because I think art in public spaces is a really, really important thing to pursue. We're not just talking about functional links, we're talking about places that are enjoyable to be, places that make one think about other alternatives, and places that actually ask you questions. And if you think about all the great cities in the world, the experiences that you tend to remember are those narrow little streets that then open out onto a great big, plaza or piazza or something like that. And the people that are coming and going there, the cafes, the sidewalk, the fountains, the dogs, the pigeons, the whole bit. Or in Venice, just getting lost is a beautiful experience. So, cities are on the national stage in terms of debate. Why is that? Well, politicians have realised that the productivity and the wealth generation of the nation actually relies on our cities. Australia has 80% of our population living in cities of over 100,000. We're probably one of the most urbanised countries in the world. And there are some big challenges there. We don't just want to make money, we actually want them to be livable, we want them to be walkable, we want them to be environmentally responsible and sustainable. Now, sustainability, as you know, is becoming an abused word. There are some governments that just take their Planning Act and put sustainability on the front cover. You never actually see it in the legislation apart from the front cover. So I think there's a lot in terms of looking forward that the competition, that CAPITheticAL can explore. So we've heard from Dave about the history, and it's great to research all of that. I guess where I'm coming from is to challenge you to think about the future and how a competition, an ideas competition like this, could be used to explore ideas about public realm, about art and architecture. I think there is, a real opportunity for collaboration there, and I would suggest that to you as well, that a collaborative endeavour, I think, is a very important part of how we're going to get to where we want to be actually as a society. I mean, no longer can we just sit in silos and say, well, I do my little bit and then give it to you and you do your little bit, and, it's not like that anymore. Things are so fast. Is anyone on Twitter at the moment? Am I being reported on Twitter? Things are so fast. We're communicating at a really massive speed. So that leads to breaking down silos, having collaboration, partnerships, and that means treating each other with some mutual respect and trust. It's not about conquering again anymore. It's more about collaborating and doing things that are going to be examined through a whole lot of lenses. So that's why cities, I think, are very, very topical, because some parts of our cities definitely are not working, and we should be challenging ourselves about that. Canberra itself is a fairly spread out city, so from a transport point of view, there's some real challenges for Canberra. I mean, if I was doing Canberra again, I'd make it a much denser city. That would just be my approach. So I think the competition is an opportunity to explore those ideas. So getting back to the mechanic role, I can say that stage 1 submissions are due on the 31st of January 2012. Those shortlisted will be announced the end of May. The shortlisted entries may be asked to develop their entries further in a stage 2 process, which then closes in November 2012. So there's lots of time to develop fantastic entries. Prize winners are then announced in March 2013 to coincide with the anniversary of the Centenary. I think it's the 12th of March. I think that's the date. Robyn's talked about the prize money, $100,000, $70,000 is a minimum first prize. I mean, that's a big prize in competition land. I mean, let me tell you, I might be working on the weekend on this one too. So design students and art students are encouraged to enter the competition individually or in groups, and the jury may award a student prize to the value of $10,000 where high quality submissions are received from design students. And of course, you could win the big prize as well, so that's quite an interesting twist. So your jurors are going to be Professor Alastair Swain, ACT Government Architect, Professor Barbara Norman, Head of Discipline, Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Canberra, Councillor John McInerney, an architect and town planner and a councillor within the City of Sydney, Callum Morton, an artist from Victoria. He exhibited in the 2007 Venice Art Biennale, amongst many other achievements. So an artist is there. Dr. Catherine Bull, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Melbourne and Adjunct Professor at QUT. To celebrate, we'll end the competition with a curated exhibition in Canberra featuring the selected winners. Registration is free online, www.CAPITheticAL.com.au. The Institute and, of course, Robyn encourages all artists, designers and yourself to be part of the competition and to share your creative ideas for our nation's capital. Thank you very much for having me here.